What is that, David? We are in Dimona, and you're showing me the real Dimona.
Yes. So right now we are outside of a kindergarten for youth that belong to the community of African Hebrew Israelites. It's a group of diasporic African people, African Americans who immigrated to Israel and their descendants who have been born here. And so outside this kindergarten, we have instructions on the dress code of the community. So, are you dressed for the glory and beauty of Yahweh? That is their phrasing for Yahweh or Jah, God, Jehovah. So, are you dressed correctly? And then it explains how you should do so. You should have low heels. You should not have lipstick. Your head should be covered. There should be fringes on the bottoms of your clothes, as it's written in the Old Testament. Should be the proper length. It should be long. Your neck should be covered, etc., etc. And then, if so, are you dressed correctly? If so, Bruchim Habayim, you're welcome. If not, if you're not dressed correctly, we love you, and we will see you when you are dressed correctly. So, go get dressed correctly, then come back, and then you're welcome to enter.
But you are still beloved.
But you're still loved. We still love you.
So we just went through a slum. Is that correct? A slum?
Yeah, it's buildings that used to be an absorption center that were neglected and fell into disuse, and then the community moved into them. And over the years, they have done some repairs, but they've had very meager means, very limited resources. So still outwardly, there's in a state of disrepair. So it's a poor neighborhood, certainly.
But this poor neighborhood is directly beside a very wealthy neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Literally right across the street from an extremely wealthy neighborhood. Yeah, you see that socioeconomic schism butting right up against itself.
But in the wealthy neighborhood, you see white-skinned people with dogs, with fighter dogs, and in the poor neighborhood, you see dark-skinned people.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. I mean,
it's not mixed.
No. Look, it's very rare to see an African person in a neighborhood that is not impoverished in Dimona. Mm-hmm. Some people live outside of this community, but then they live in other relatively rundown or cheaper areas of the city. That's a function of various things. One being that for most of their existence here, most of these people have not had legal status. The government did not want to grant them status because they were not blood Jews, and they didn't agree to convert to the right kind of Judaism, a European brand of Judaism. They insisted on sticking to their Afrocentric version. And as a result, the government stripped them of status. If you don't have status, you don't have a legal work permit. If you don't have a legal work permit, you can't get a decent job where you aren't exploited and paid subsistence income. So because of that, with very little opportunities to work and very few opportunities to have gainful employment, people don't have many economic options. So they're stuck in cycles of poverty. That's the main reason I'd say for that.
And behind the wealthy neighborhood, there was a cemetery. Can you just summarize this very sad and cruel story?
Yeah, sure. So when the first African Hebrews immigrated to Israel, at first they were treated like all or most of the other brown Jews who moved to Israel. You're from Morocco, you're from India, a dark-skinned, dark-hued Jew, we'll send you to some small town in the middle of the desert to help increase the population in these desert towns. And so the first group of African Hebrews were settled here like any of the other Jews, get an apartment, get furniture, but then they quickly realized they weren't the right kind of Jew and they weren't willing to convert, as I described earlier. So then they said, okay, you're not willing to convert, we're going to drive you out of here. And they actually, those few members who had passed away in the first couple of years, they removed their bodies from the Jewish cemetery, disinterred them, and essentially dumped them in a plot of land outside the edge of town. And for many years, that's where the community's burial grounds were. It quickly became a trash dump where other people in the city would dump their garbage there. So it was really disrespectful the way that their loved ones were treated. And most recently, the government has decided to expand the city eastward, mainly because the government is moving its army bases from the center of the country down to the south of the country, because that land that these army bases are sitting on is very valuable, and it makes more sense to move the army down to the south where they have lots of room in the desert to shoot their guns and sell off those valuable parcels of land to make a profit. So with these army bases moving down south, they now need housing for soldiers to live in the southern towns so that they can commute to these army bases. So there's going to be a rapid population growth in the south, and for this they need to expand the existing cities, build new neighborhoods. One of those new neighborhoods that's being built is on the eastern flank of Dimona, exactly where this old cemetery has been. And so in the last few months we have the cemetery being leveled and destroyed to make way for this new neighborhood that's being built there on the edge of town.
But there are also some good news. Please tell me again about the detention center. A law has been passed recently.
I'll tell you about it, but unfortunately it's not good news. But did you want to do it outside here, or did you want to do it indoors? You want me to continue talking right here?
Is it a long?
I'll try to make it brief.
Okay, then we can do it in one take.
Okay, sure. So, while we're on the topic of African peoples in Israel, we'd be remiss if we did not mention the African Asylum Seekers, which is a group of about 50,000 Africans, mainly from Sudan and Eritrea, who entered the country between 2007 and 2012, fleeing despotic governments, fleeing ethnic cleansing, and often experiencing human trafficking and tortures on the way here. And the government's response at first was to allow them in, but send them to essentially create a refugee camp out of some of the poorest neighborhoods in Tel Aviv, just sending Africans to South Tel Aviv without giving them the right to work, to have meaningful employment and support themselves, but without giving them any accommodations either, and without any opportunity to support themselves and get out of the ghetto. Essentially what you had was these poor neighborhoods to begin with doubling and tripling in size. So taking poor neighborhoods, making them even poorer, which ramped up racism against the Africans. What people who were dispossessed to begin with became even more disempowered. So since 2012, the government's policy has been to pass laws which allow it to actually round up these Africans from the city streets and round them into desert detention centers. And once they're in these desert detention centers, the government then puts pressure on them, saying, well, you're here and you'll never get out unless you agree to self-deport. Here, we'll even give you a little bit of money if you agree to get out the country. So they don't have this stain on the country's human rights record of actually physically deporting them back to the tortures they fled from. It's put pressure on you, round you into a camp until you feel so hopeless that you agree to go back even to the things you fled from. Now, it's a draconian law, even by Israeli standards, and that's why the Israeli Supreme Court outright quashed the law. In fact, it didn't just do this once, it did it twice. It's the first law in the history of the country that the Supreme Court actually overruled twice. Said it's unconstitutional, it's against human dignities, and so therefore the government must shut down these detention centers. So the first time they did it, the government just created a loophole and legislated another law, in many ways worse than the first, which kept it open. Okay, so again they bring it back to the Supreme Court. Well, that process takes a year. came back to the Supreme Court, and once again the Supreme Court said no, it's still unconstitutional. It's still, a grievous violation of human rights, and they ordered the government to shut down these detention centers within 3 months. Within those 3 months, sure enough, the government whipped together some new legislation, and for the third time they passed the law authorizing it to round these Africans up into these detention centers, though they've committed no crime except for applying for asylum by international law, legal standards. So now, within just a few days before the law was to come into, or the Supreme Court ruling had to be followed, the government re-legislated it, and now these detention centers stay open. Of course, human rights groups will bring it back to the Supreme Court, but that may take another year. In the meantime, African people continue to be rounded up out of Israeli cities into these detention centers. What's ironic is that it was the last act of the government before it dissolved itself. Right now we're heading into elections. They're called for March 17th. But the last thing the government did before it dissolved itself to prepare for elections was to pass this law ensuring that the Africans will remain behind bars and continue to be rounded up. So it's a very sad state of affairs, and this is the way that Israel decided to spend International Human Rights Day this week.
Just the last question, why are there so many African Americans in Dimona? Is there any reason, or it's just by accident?
Well, it's because this is where the government sent them when they first arrived. Like, if you see what is the demographic composition of Dimona, it's mixed, but primarily the first groups to settle here were Moroccan, Indian, African American. Later we have a large substantial group of Russian people who have moved to town too, and of course there's many others of all stripes. But the three groups I mentioned are all generally darker skinned Israelis, and that it was the government policy because it wanted people to live in the desert, just like it wants people to live in the West Bank, just like it wants people to live in the communities around Gaza. Often people don't want to live in these areas. They're far from the commercial centers of the country where there are better jobs. But I guess in a sense they're kind of like human shields. The government wants people out in the border areas so it can stake claim to those frontier lands. So these are essentially frontier lands because the Negev was almost not populated by Jews. And, even still till this day, if we look historically, Beersheba, Bir al-Saba was a Bedouin city, or a Bedouin town. These areas were just Bedouin peoples living here. There were very, very, very few Jews living here. And so the government wanted not for there only to be a Jewish majority in the country as a whole, but it also wanted regionally for there to be Jewish majorities, for there not to be any regions of the country in which Jews were not 50%. So it needed to encourage Jews to come down here. What to do? Most people don't want to live in the middle of the desert or other frontier area. But when it was darker-skinned Jews moving to the country, the government was a bit of a bully in the sense that it could direct people and tell them where it wanted them to go and instruct them to go and send them to go where it wanted them. And that's what happened. So this is one of those towns where the government specifically sent the Jews from the Orient or the East or those who were darker skinned to live in this town. And that's why there's a larger proportion of African American Hebrews living in Dimona. There's also some in some of the other southern towns like Arad, like Mitzpe Ramon, and like Yerucham. But Dimona is where they were first centered, where they first established their community.
Do you know something about Al-Arakib? Are you following the events there?
I know some, but I'm by far not an expert.
Yeah, okay.
So
then I ask,
best to ask me about
expert.
stuff I know really well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot.